OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about underfitting and overfitting versus right and wrong, using terms from computer science to help us think through historic development. There's a lot of, these are terms that have been used throughout OG Rose, and I think it's good to draw attention to them because I think they can help us understand the right way to, say, think about philosophers of the past who we may no longer agree with, and yet who I think it would be erroneous to discard and think are irrelevant and quote-unquote wrong. I think the language of right and wrong in certain contexts, now I'm not going to be arguing that it's not true that there is no right and wrong. I'm going to be arguing that that language can be sometimes problematic, especially if it is not considered in light of or alongside or with underfitting and overfitting and quote-unquote fittingness. Now, I might not be using these terms correctly relative to how they're used in computer science. I think I am, but if I'm not, I'm sorry about that. Basically, the idea of underfitting is when you take a model and you, like in computer science, and you have the data points. There's not enough correlation. Like when you try to see if the data fits into the model, you just don't reach any conclusions. It's not quite there. Overfitting is when you end up with like a model that's like superly complex, right? Like, you know, there's this old saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful by Dr. Box. The idea that if I were to perfectly model that bookcase over there, it would be so complex that it would be like impossible to use. So there's kind of a trade-off between accuracy and usability. And overfitting is where a model so perfectly matches the data that it's not really useful. It's not really distinct from the data itself. Why not just read the data? So those are kind of generally how I think they're used in computer science. The way I'm using them here kind of philosophically, and what I just told you about computer science, please don't take my word for it. Go ask an expert. The way I'm kind of using it philosophically is more so to kind of have this idea that when we take someone like Hegel, who obviously I'm a fan of his science of logic and his logic, and we use Hegel to describe, say, the identity of the bookcase as a bookcase, I'm kind of using something very complex to describe something that Aristotle's logic would describe well enough. Now, ultimately, the reason we have to move from Hegel to Aristotle, I think, is because Aristotle's logic is not complete, and we overfit it, as I'll explain, when we apply it to, say, emergence, becoming, identity through time, and so on. But at the same time, if I use Hegel, if all I need to know is a simple identity to get a task done or to do something with the community or other people quickly, then really trying to think Hegel to understand this bookcase would be it would be underfitting, because it's kind of like I'm pulling Hegel's complex model down and applying it to something that it's not needed for. So it's kind of underfitting. It's not appropriate. Overfitting tends to be our problem because we move forward through history but bring the past with us. Like the only way we ever know the history, the only thing we ever bring into the future is the past. And so whatever models we've been using is what we bring into what we encounter. It's very natural. So it's very natural to overfit Aristotle. And so then try to use Aristotle to explain, say, emergence, becoming, or complex phenomenon, geopolitics, globalization, a lot of stuff that we've described. So we tend to overfit Aristotle. Likewise, it's very natural to say overfit Newton instead of some of the different physics theories out today, which I know there's a big debate about all that. But, we have this tendency to overfit. But in the same way that it's kind of ridiculous, or it's underfitting to apply Hegel to understanding this bookshelf if all I need to know is that it's a bookshelf. Likewise, using extremely advanced physics to explain the curvature of a baseball or to understand why a baseball falls the way it does is also underfitting. I'm underfitting. I'm trying to fit the model to a phenomenon that's simpler than what it can apply to. And again, this is just how I'm using the terms here in regard to thinkers. I'm not saying that everyone has to use them that way, but the main thing I'd like to do is introduce really thinking about thinkers like Aristotle or Descartes, or maybe philosophers we don't agree with as much anymore, or think we need to kind of quote-unquote move beyond or negate, sublate, is that we need Aristotle to get to Hegel. You have to go through history to understand the new thinking of today. You have to have background to understand what is currently present. And so in this way, it just doesn't seem adequate to say that Aristotle was wrong. And I think the language of overfitting and underfitting fits generally with sublation anyway, that Hegel's a big on. So I think fittingness just aligns with Hegel's overall epistemology anyway. But you see, the point is, imagine you would go back to, say, the 1200s, and you would talk about YouTube. I promise you no one would have a clue what you're talking about. And you would say, well, of course, YouTube hasn't been invented. But I kind of mean it in a deeper sense. Like, they wouldn't even know what a video was. They wouldn't know what electricity was. They wouldn't know what a computer was. They wouldn't know what, like, infrastructure was, really. I mean, not like we know it. They wouldn't know wires. They wouldn't know heating. They wouldn't know, like, cell phones. There's so much background info that you need to make sense of YouTube that is, like, invisible to you. It's all invisible to you because, like, you absorb it from your historic moment, right? You just kind of learn growing up. What is electricity? What is a cell phone? What is technology? You just kind of absorb all this. You just know it. Whereas if you went back to someone in the 1200s, you'd have to explain it all, and it would basically be impossible. So what ends up happening is, as you go through history, you build up background knowledge that allows you to make sense of new technologies or new developments. That without that background information, you just simply couldn't make sense of it. So likewise, without, like, the entire history of philosophy, basically, then when you get to Hegel, you couldn't make sense of Hegel. Like, I mean, I'm starting to think we're only now just kind of making sense of Hegel because now we have the internet. Now we have a better understanding of, like, quantum mechanics, all these different things. So there's, like, a historic background you have to go through to make sense of Hegel. And without that background, you just simply can't comprehend it. So you have to have, say, Aristotle in order to make sense of Hegel. So if you are making sense of Hegel, you are making sense of him thanks to Aristotle. So to say that Aristotle was wrong or not needed or we've moved beyond Aristotle is problematic. Now, again, I mean, I spent a lot of time critiquing A is A, and certainly I can create the impression that I think Aristotle is wrong, and there is a sense in which I think he is wrong. But it's a wrongness that comes from a historic development, not relative to his thinking at the time in his moment of historic development. And that's different. That's different. That's a different kind of quote-unquote wrongness from, say, answering math as 2 + 2 = 5. They're not the same in character. Of the error is not the same of character. So seeing as our variability to say make sense of Hegel is due to Aristotle, and I can go through many fields with many topics and make the similar point. Then it just makes more sense to talk about overfitting and underfitting Aristotle. And also, since it's possible to, underfit Hegel, I think that goes to show you why we should still use Aristotle in different categories when his logic is appropriate and most useful. It's just that we need to know when the model should not apply because it would be overfitting. Because you'd be applying it too much. And in the way I guess I connect that to the computer science understanding of overfitting is where in computer science, like, you have to bend the model around so much to fit the data that the model is kind of useless. Likewise, with Aristotle, you have to do so many, like, gymnastic loops or denial. It ends up kind of conspiratorial, right? Like, you force things to work. Like a Thomas Pynchon novel, so that Aristotle's A is A functions. But at that point, you're just creating assumptions or criteria or blocking out data so that it works. So it feels to me forceful in the same manner, and in that very forcefulness renders the model useless or the conclusions useless, so on and so on. So we have a dilemma here, which would mean that we need a historic background by which to make sense of the foreground of now. But if we have that background, then we run the risk of thinking of previous thinkers as right or wrong, when really they're overfitting or underfitting. So there's a certain risk here that can't be avoided. To put it another way, we require thinkers of the past who are now incomplete to us in order to have the historic background we require today to experience and discover new ideas in our foreground. But that means we are necessarily vulnerable to overfitting and underfitting, a necessary price so that we might think anew today. So if we're able to think new thoughts, that means we're at risk of overfitting and underfitting. But I think if we use that language, or at least know about that language versus just right and wrong, then I think we're less likely to make this mistake. And we're more also likely to think in terms of historic developmentalism, as I think is necessary for us to think Hegel today, which, as Dr. Lass and I have described, we both think is necessary because the consequences for not doing so can be quite dire. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Anchor, all these things. And thank you so much for your time.